Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Hi there. My name is Sarah Kelly Palmer,
And I'm Kayla David.
and welcome to Be Well Live. For those of you, if this is your first time joining Kayla and I, we are part of the healing department at Family Service of Rhode Island, and we come together on Facebook as part of what we call our Be Well Live series to discuss various topics about wellness and how to deal with the COVID-19 crisis. Family Service of Rhode Island is a social service agency. We serve the entire state of Rhode Island, and we offer a variety of different services, including telehealth counseling.
We will be joining together today and every other Wednesday at 10 a.m. for discussions that support wellness during COVID 19. So we ask you to please take a moment to share this with your friends or to start a watch party, which can be done on Facebook. You can also find us on YouTube. And help us reach as many people as we can with this information about being well during COVID 19. As Sarah mentioned earlier, now more than ever, it's important for us to be able to reach out if we're struggling. It is important for us to help our loved ones, for us to connect with assistance if we need it and we're struggling, and to help others connect if they're struggling. COVID 19 has put just a tremendous amount of stress for a long period of time now on all of us in many ways, and that's impacting our well being and our mental health.
And Kayla, I think today's topic and today's guest is really, really timely. I know all of our topics are really related to kind of wellness and COVID-19, but this one I think is really hitting home because September is Suicide Prevention Month. And we all know that 2020 has been a tough year collectively, right, for everyone across our state, our country, and really the world. But particularly here in the US with COVID-19, our economy and all of the job loss that's happening, unemployment. We've had, demonstrations across the country demanding racial justice and equity, and most recently, the wildfires that are really rampant on the West Coast. And I don't know if you noticed last night, our sky, and even this morning, where we here in Rhode Island are actually seeing that impact from those wildfires. So I think all of these things are really leaving many of us, many people and families dealing with increased stress, isolation, a lot of frustration and anger, and in some cases, just this feeling of desperation. And, you know, because of COVID-19 and all of these adversities that we have been facing nationally, we're seeing an increase in depression, anxiety, sleep disturbances, and just overall traumatic stress symptoms in the general population. And I even think for those who were dealing with those issues prior to COVID-19, they're even getting exacerbated even more.
Yeah. And as Sarah, as you were saying, bearing witness to suffering and ourselves experiencing COVID 19, and all of the adversities that come with it, which is a potentially traumatic experience,
Mm-hmm.
that long term stress can become toxic and it impacts all different parts of our well being. And, you know, annually, on average, we see 123 suicides each day in this country. So, not annually, daily, we see 123 suicides
Yeah.
each day. It's the 10th leading cause of death in America, the second leading cause of death for those ages 15 to 24. And
Yeah.
we've been seeing a steady rise in youth suicide with a 56% increase nationally in death due to suicide in the last less than 2 decades for individuals ages 10 to 24. So, with
Mm-hmm.
an increase in the stressors and the symptoms due to this global pandemic and all of the adversity that
Oh, I think we lost you, Kayla. So I'm going to pick up where Kayla left off. So So to talk about suicide prevention and this important topic, today we have a special guest, Leigh Reposa. Welcome, Leigh. She is a licensed independent clinical social worker and the program manager of the Rhode Island Youth Suicide Prevention Program at Rhode Island Student Assistance Services. Welcome, Leigh. We're so happy to have you.
Thank you so much for the invitation. This is great.
And we're hoping Kayla can join us back. She's having internet trouble. But Leigh, we know you've been working for the past 11 years in Rhode Island with a focus on youth suicide prevention. And as part of your work, you and the members of the Rhode Island Youth Suicide Prevention Project have trained, this is very impressive, over 10,000 adults and youth in 6 core cities in Rhode Island using a suicide prevention training model that is evidence-based. You have a very impressive resume, Leigh. You also serve as the chairperson for the state Rhode Island Youth Suicide Prevention Advisory Committee, and you're an active member of the Rhode Island Medical Examiner's Office Child Death Review Team. So thank you. We're so happy to have you. We were hoping to kick things off and have you speak a little bit about your work here in Rhode Island and what your organization is doing to focus in and combat youth suicide.
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about that. So for those of you who are joining us from Rhode Island, I realize that the reach is regional and national in these times as far as presentations and conversations that we're having around the country on the same topics. So for those of you who are joining us locally, Rhode Island Student Assistance Services is a nonprofit agency, and we've been around for about 33 years. We provide substance abuse, intervention and prevention services in middle schools and high schools in Rhode Island. And it is a part of the Student Assistance Program, which is also a national evidence-based model. So that's what our agency's focus and mission is to reduce substance use and abuse for adolescents, and also to support adolescents who might be coming from using and abusing family systems or families. And what the agency has had the opportunity to do is work directly with the federal government, with SAMHSA, which I can say is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, and the Rhode Island Department of Health. We have been awarded funding actually for the last 11 years, which is extremely impressive for our little state. We provide suicide prevention services, resources, and mainly prevention strategies, which, like you just touched upon, is training for adults that work with youth. And then also we've been in the classroom over the years teaching students how to identify if a peer or a sibling or someone in their life is also struggling and how to get them connected with help. So we're going to be talking a little bit more about what that means. And for parents who are joining us and providers, we'll talk about some of the resources that we provide and then some of the national resources as well.
Awesome. So I know, Leigh, one thing that I know that you and your organization do, which I love, is you kind of frame this idea of getting this evidence-based training for people that interact with youth, right, as something that should be as typical as like CPR, right, as a safety thing, right? And yes. I think that, you know, in our society, a lot of people have this feeling and this idea that children or youth, really, especially younger children, couldn't possibly know about, attempt, or complete suicide. And yet what we know and what the research really shows us, which Kayla mentioned earlier, is that suicide is the second leading cause of death for youth ages 10 to 24. So knowing that and kind of putting that out there for all the people who are joining us today, what can you share about what are some of the risk factors for suicide that we see for those kids and youth that think about it?
That's a great question. And I think I would just start off saying that a common myth is that, you know, you don't talk about things like suicide or depression or trauma or anxiety with little ones. And I will say that that's not true. The earlier you start talking about something and having a conversation, you're letting that child know that this is something that we feel comfortable talking about. And if they're hearing it at home, if they're hearing it at school, if they're hearing that in the community, then they know it's something that is important to talk about and name And that way, if things kind of escalate, then we're in more of a position to know that something's happening and to get that child or that person connected with help. So having said that, welcome back, Kayla.
Yay!
Hi, thank you.
I think we're about to talk a little bit about risk factors. And so I'm going to talk about risk factors, and I'm also going to talk about protective factors and then behavioral cues and warning signs. So they're kind of all lumped together. I would say that the main risk factor, or the protective factor rather, is knowing your child and having a connection with them, an ongoing connection. And a lot of times parents say to me, well, you know, they're just kind of being a teenager. And, you know, this is probably just normal up and down stuff that they're experiencing. I'm really not too worried about it. So I always say, you know what, you know your child best, or if you're in an education setting, you know your students best, because you have a consistent relationship connection with them and visibility and, you know, their supervision, but to really pay attention to those changes in that young person's, I call it baseline. So they're every day. So if they're, you know, pretty upbeat, you know, and pretty happy, you know, most of the month, and then all of a sudden you're noticing 3 to 5 days a month they're more cranky than they've ever been, and you know they're just not themselves, then this is where we want to start having conversations about what's going on. We don't want to wait until crisis. That is really why we do these trainings and presentations and conversations, is that we want to make people more aware and comfortable with having conversations before we're now at the, you know, escalated crisis. Now we're in, you know, stabilization mode versus support mode. So some risk factors I would say that parents can look for is, like you said, Sarah, changes in, we call it sleep hygiene. So change in sleep patterns. So if they're oversleeping, undersleeping, and there's not an underlying medical condition going on, you know, where they're taking some sort of medication, you know, that's making them more sleepy. We also want to look for changes in eating. So if they're overeating or undereating, changes in appetite. If you notice that they are more apathetic or just angry, and they've never really been angry before. So for those of you who might be in the audience that have seen the movie Inside Out, there are a number of different emotions that are represented in that movie. It's joy, anger, sadness. Yeah. And so we want to, I actually put up pictures of anger and say, you know, or sadness or joy, and say, which ones are you feeling? And then I normalize with students or youth that it's okay to feel a range of emotions, even sometimes at the same time, and to validate that. So I would say that anger is a risk factor that we didn't normally notice was a risk factor for maybe depression. Really want to make sure that we're acknowledging that if you see an increase in that. Also, if a student or a child is starting to say, I really wish I was dead. I wish I could just go to sleep, not wake up. I want this over. I can't do this anymore. So there might be things that they're even writing or they're posting, or you're noticing that they're just kind of a little less, they have more outbursts of things that are pretty serious. One thing we don't want to do is just say, you know what, you're going to get over it. Everything, you know, this is just what you go through when you're this age. We don't want to dismiss or minimize, because that could be a missed opportunity to have a conversation and to de-escalate what's really going on. Or in some cases, they might actually be considering suicide or an attempt, and we want to make sure that we intervene. More risk factors, behavioral cues. I would say if there's a student who's had some sort of loss, significant loss, a lot of times the media picks up on if there's been a breakup of a intimate partner relationship. That could be boyfriend, girlfriend, boyfriend. And then also a loss, a significant loss, maybe of a caretaker, or maybe a health change. But loss is definitely a huge risk factor. The other risk factor that I want to make sure we point out, and this can start as early as 9, 10, 11 years old, is substance use. So this could be vaping. This could be, you know, starting to look in your home medicine cabinet, and you start to see that there's a few Tylenol missing, or there's some medication. So we want to reduce the access to that medication, of course. And also if a student or a young person is starting to experiment with things like drugs and alcohol. Drugs and alcohol are, specifically alcohol is a depressant. And if you have a young person in your life who is already depressed and maybe they're not diagnosed yet, that alcohol is actually going to, like you said before, kind of exacerbate that depression. And in the moment of hopelessness and despair, if that student or child has access to alcohol and possibly means like pills or a firearm, they might be more likely to act in that moment because their brains are still developing and they might not be able to manage that executive functioning, which is that impulse control and decision making.
And I think, Leigh, I think something that is really kind of concerning within the whole context of this COVID-19, when I think about youth, especially those younger youth, is this idea of all the distance learning that's happening. And, for many kids, going to school, being at school was part of a safety net, right? Of other adults that might see these risk factors or warning signs.
Yes.
And I know that I think that's one thing, Kayla and I have talked about a lot is how can we really encourage teachers, even virtually, to be paying attention to those things and really encouraging those conversations and supporting parents to have those conversations. Because I think now more than ever, many kids who maybe are at more risk no longer have that connection of actually physically being in school. Right?
Yeah, so I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because the C word that we often reference in these trainings or presentations is connectedness, and the power of connectedness, and the fact that there's not just one person who's in a student's life that has that connection. It could be and when we're in the building, it could be somebody who works in the food service department, the front office staff. It could be the educator in the classroom, the para educator, the para professional, somebody that's a teacher's aide. And now in the virtual world, sometimes they're in school and then they're out of school, for a number of days. So making sure that the educators are trained in what we talked about before, which is those warning signs, and that the educators and the parents know what the resources are in the school if they are concerned about the student, and to not wait. If they have a gut feeling that something's off with their child or a student, make sure that they escalate that to the student support team, and maybe ask at the beginning of the year, now that everything's fresh, what's the process for referring my student if I'm concerned? Do I call the school social worker? Do I call the school principal? Do I call the nurse? And then making sure, at the building level or the administration gets that protocol out so that parents know what their resources are, because more than ever, they might feel alone. And they might have more than one student at home that's struggling, and they themselves, you yourself as a parent, might be struggling. And that can just be so overwhelming. And just knowing what your lifeline is, and also we call it the helping team around your student or your child, can be an intervention. So I'm going to use there's a meme that actually came about yesterday that I thought would be really timely to show the audience today, about the power of connection and how it could really be anybody. It could be the person at the Dunkin' Donuts that makes your coffee every day. So this meme says, I'm here for you. The person says, thanks, I'm going through a really tough time, so this means a lot. And sorry, I lost all my contacts. Who's this? And then the person says, this is actually your Uber driver. I'm here to pick you up. Okay. So if you notice, that person kind of de-escalated and was happy that somebody acknowledged that they're struggling. And it was the Uber driver. Right. So it could literally be anybody that could make that difference and make that connection intervention a reality for someone. And to just not underestimate just the little pieces of kindness that you can share to make that connection, and then foster the connection with that individual.
And Leigh, we actually had a question from a viewer. And I think this is so important as we talk about connection and just how all of us can really be there for one another if we know those warning signs, those symptoms or behaviors. So we had Margaret ask, what symptoms or behaviors should teachers look for if they're doing just virtual learning or teaching?
Oh, great, Margaret, absolutely. And so actually what I said before is the same for teachers. They can know, they're in a position to notice if a student shows or attends classes virtually and they're tired, they're more lethargic, maybe they're taking longer to log on, they're taking longer to do assignments. I realize in this day and age, people are wearing different types of clothing, but I give an example that there are changes even that you can notice in a student virtually. Maybe they don't look as put together as they normally do. Maybe you notice a change in their hygiene. Maybe you can tell that they're wearing the same shirt day in, day out. That could mean a lot of other things. But for educators, definitely to actually ask, how's everybody doing today? And do check-ins. The other thing with educators is that absenteeism is also a lot of times has a story behind it. There might be a reason that might be a risk factor. There might be something going on at home, and you notice that student normally is logging on and now they're not, and there's nobody able to get in touch with that student. And then the other thing as far as risk factors is just to kind of look around the room, not to be nosy, but you might just see different things. Maybe there's, posters, or, you notice that they're in the third floor of their, apartment and there's no air conditioning. And maybe that's why they're not really logging on, because the air conditioner broke or their power went off. But to just kind of keep your spidey sense out, I guess, and just, not to dismiss little things that might just be a little bit off about your students. Does that answer your question, Margaret?
So I think Leigh, one of the, like you've said so many things right now that are so important around protective factors, right? So having people in our life that are looking out for us, we know for kids, the number one kind of protective factor is just having a caring and supportive adult in their life.
Consistently, yes.
Consistently. And also you spoke about naming it. So you've already kind of spoken to some protective factors, but I wonder if there are more that you could share with us that do reduce risk of suicide.
So I actually have a picture that you can feel free to show. During this time of COVID, I don't know if other people have noticed, but we have emptied we've emptied the shelters, the animal shelters. And so I really kind of always want to not underestimate what I call the power of the paw. So students might now have another connection, another protective factor where they're either caretaking or they're getting comfort or unconditional love from a pet. So I always just kind of ask, who's at home that, might be something that you look forward to being at home, and they might say their pet or their cat or their dog. Other protective factors are you all, folks that are in the provider community that are providing telehealth, which you at the beginning of the show, as well as ongoing just supports. Maybe it's tutoring, or maybe it's medical care, or seeing a doctor regularly, or also a mentor, somebody that's an adult that may not be a family member but is consistently in someone's child's life or a young person's life. And I also don't underestimate the power of the employer. So sometimes students might have an after school or during the day job in the community, and they might, really connect with their peers, at that local grocer and their manager, and they might not have that in the virtual world, and they might not have that in person in their school. So we always want to look at the whole student, the whole child, and who else is in their life. And I do use the example of, the local mini mart. They go and get their snack during the day, or they're going to the skate park and they have their friends there. I always ask, who else is in your life? Who are your trusted adults? And then make sure that if they are struggling, that we revisit, don't you normally talk to so-and-so, and, make sure that they're getting connected.
Great.
Awesome.
And Leigh, we had another question in the chat. Wondering, so Kara asked, wondering if you have some creative ways to stay connected with young adults, specifically those who live alone. So she said FaceTime, of course, and texting, but what if they are isolating? So I'm hopeful that you could share with us some creative ways.
So for those of you who might be viewers who remember Columbo is a gentleman who really didn't take no for an answer, but he was persistent. So I just say, be annoying, be persistent, be the nag in a nice, a kind way. But just kind of find different ways to connect. Sometimes it's just, I wear a lot of Wonder Woman, Hello Kitty, a lot of youth-friendly kind of things. My cell phone case is always something that's youth-friendly, just to kind of, always see something that maybe you connect with them and then but be creative and be persistent. If a student says, I'm fine, leave me alone, that's me going to continue to go back and say, and then you're sending a message that you care and you notice that something is going on. And it might not be suicide, but it's something that we want to explore. So I always say, I'm invested in you, both in the classroom and out of the classroom. And that is, that's a strategy that I think we can use as parents, or get somebody else involved. Maybe it's a sibling that they're more receptive to right now. So kind of, use your helping team to get the message across that you care and that they need some help.
I think that's so importantly. And I think when we think about kind of parents and the parental role, I think we hear a lot from parents around this topic, that how do I even start this conversation? What words do I use with my child if I suspect that they're at risk or maybe contemplating suicide? Because as you mentioned before, there's that myth around, well, if I talk about it, then it's going to contribute to it, right? Or,
Right.
kind of move it along. And we know that that is not the case. So what words should parents use? And what age do you think is too young to be starting to talk about suicide? Because we also get that question, right?
I actually just had a friend who's started a family. And what I noticed is the baby books that I was leaning towards and that I actually gravitated towards and gave her as a shower present were books about feelings, emotions, maybe having a new sibling, and just normalizing that language right from the beginning. So you're not introducing something when they're 15, you're laying the groundwork. So the earlier the better. And then as far as I know that you mentioned distance learning and a student that might be isolating, monitoring. So if a parent or a caretaker or if a student is living in a placement, the monitoring of what they're doing on social media is important. It's just like for those of us who used to play outside, we thought we were just playing outside, riding our bikes, but you know what? Our parents were peeking out the window, seeing if we were okay, if we had driven by in the last minute. If we didn't, they got concerned. It's the same type of monitoring that you're doing in social media. It's not that you are, and you say that you're open about it, you're transparent. I'm going to check on you because that's the world you're in, and I'm concerned, and then just let them know that privacy. Yes, you have a right to privacy. But if I'm concerned, I'm going to say, you know what, I'm going to log into your account and see, some of the chats that you might be having. And sometimes actually parents find out about other students or other children, not their own children, who are also struggling. So those are things to empower parents to monitor.
Nice.
Well, and that was one of our questions, because I think we are hearing a lot, especially now that social media is linked to increases in self-interest behaviors, increases in or decreases in self-esteem in youth, especially young women. But we also know that any connection is a protective factor. So with the increased use in electronics and virtual connection, especially now during the pandemic, where that might be our only form of connection.
Right.
Leigh, what would you say to parents and to other adults in children's lives about phone and computer use? So this really difficult situation.
Yeah, I mean, assuming that it's they're using it for school, and then maybe having boundaries or screen time breaks that are incorporated in. And then I really kind of just so parents, you all know your students and your children better than anybody. I try to discourage taking away electronics as a disciplinary kind of because it might actually be the only connection. If you're going to have some disciplinary and it does involve electronics, maybe not take it all away, but still have an opportunity for them to connect, and maybe make a list of the things that they are still allowed to connect with. But taking it all away, that's when we start to see. So I mentioned loss earlier, and loss of relationships, a loss of somebody passing away. But loss includes things like your loss of connection to the outside or the virtual world. And that can be a risk factor as well. So I just say to kind of have that conversation earlier and not just maybe spring it on them and say, the expectation is that you're doing this, this, and this. And if that doesn't happen, then we're going to start to, limit your screen time. You're not going to have and things like that. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, and I think too, especially for adolescents, we know how important their peers are to them.
Right.
So
They're huge.
Huge, right? So that loss of connection of the peers during COVID has just been a huge thing for adolescents, and I think
honestly,
you make a really good point.
Sometimes students and youth welcome the screen time break because you're the parent, and you're supposed to be the one that enforces safety both in the virtual world and in person. And it's kind of like, you wouldn't have your student, not put their seatbelt on. So there's virtual safety as well.
Yeah. So Leigh, if our listeners and parents, if they want more information or more resources about this topic, what are some good places that people can go?
So I would definitely say the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, especially if somebody is a survivor of suicide, which could mean someone has attempted before, or they've had somebody attempt in their own lives, or they've had a loss of someone by death by suicide in their lives. So the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. And then also, I would recommend for parents to have the KidsLink hotline number readily available. That is the free hotline through KidsLink, which is Access Center Bradley Hospital, for those of you who are local in Rhode Island, for any child who might be experiencing an emotional crisis. And that phone number is 1-855-543-5465. That is available 24 hours a day. Families do not need to be insured in order to access that resource. And then also the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, which is 1-800-273-TALK, TALK. And so I think we have that up on the screen. And if you have a veteran in your life, press 1, and that automatically goes to the VA Medical Center, where there is a crisis team who would actually respond if a veteran is in distress. So veterans are within that 18 to 24-year-old population. And sadly, we do have an increase of veteran suicides. And so it's really important to know those resources. So I would say those 3. And then also just to kind of know resources through Friendsway, which is an organization. If you do have a child who has had a loss, doesn't necessarily need to be by suicide. They are the organization that actually supports children in a compassionate, friendly way if they've had a loss of a parent or caretaker.
Leigh, thank you so much. And if people want to know more about Friendsway and some of their work, we did have their clinical director on a few months back, and that is available in our feed as well. Leigh, thank you so much for coming on today and to talking with us about preventing suicide and just more suicide awareness. Each and every one of us really can take away something from this conversation that ultimately could really help another person in need. So thank you. And a reminder to our listeners, if your loved one is struggling, please reach out. There are people who want to help, and you're certainly not alone. And we have our information at the bottom of the screen.
It's my pleasure. And I always just want to say that there is help and there is hope. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leigh. And everyone, please join us in 2 Wednesdays when we come back for another Be Well Live with another wellness topic related to COVID-19. Thank you all, and be safe and be well.
Thank you.